More than 40 Russian main battle tanks and over 100 armored fighting vehicles have been lost in recent months, marking one of the heaviest periods of armored losses in modern warfare. These numbers are not abstract statistics because they reflect repeated attempts to force breakthroughs with large mechanized columns that were expected to move fast, overwhelm defenses, and decide the fight by weight and momentum. Instead, many of these assaults ended in short, violent engagements where entire columns were halted, fragmented, and destroyed before they could reach their objectives. Ukrainian forces are no longer reacting late or guessing enemy intent, since aerial surveillance now detects movement early, maps routes in real time, and exposes armored formations long before contact. Once identified, these formations often lose the element of surprise, then lose coordination, and finally lose mobility in narrow corridors and mined terrain. The risk for Russia goes beyond equipment losses, because every failed mechanized push drains trained crews, consumes scarce vehicles, and forces commanders to repeat tactics that opponents already understand. The payoff for understanding this shift is clear, because it explains why battles that look powerful on paper collapse so quickly in practice. The open question remains sharp and unresolved. In an era shaped by UAVs and networked firepower, can large-scale tank and APC assaults still deliver decisive results, or has the battlefield already moved on? Russia continues to rely on large mechanized assault formations because this approach is designed to force pressure through speed, mass, and constant movement across several types of terrain at the same time. In recent operations, armored columns built around tanks, APCs, and support vehicles have been pushed forward through forest belts, village edges, and narrow dirt roads, with the clear goal of stretching Ukrainian defenses before a coordinated response can form. These assaults are planned to arrive quickly, stay dense, and maintain momentum, since commanders expect shock and volume to disrupt defenders long enough to create a breach. Once movement begins, the columns rarely pause, because stopping is seen as losing initiative, and hesitation risks turning a planned advance into a stalled formation under observation. The logic behind this method is straightforward, because armor is meant to move, absorb fire, and carry infantry into contact while artillery and support follow behind. What unfolds on the ground, however, shows how this logic is now under strain in a battlefield that is watched constantly from above. As these columns move, they must follow predictable paths created by terrain, vegetation, and existing road networks, which limits freedom of maneuver even before contact occurs. Forests channel vehicles into narrow lanes, villages force turns and slow movement, and damaged infrastructure removes many alternative routes that heavy armor cannot use. Once a column commits to a direction, reversing or spreading out becomes difficult, especially when vehicles are moving close together to maintain pace and cohesion. This density is meant to protect the formation, but it also concentrates risk when the environment is hostile and visibility is controlled by the opponent. As the advance continues, the emphasis remains on pushing forward rather than adapting, because the plan assumes that pressure itself will break resistance. Infantry is often carried close behind armor, ready to dismount quickly and secure ground, while engineers and support vehicles trail the main body. The structure looks powerful on paper, yet it depends heavily on timing, coordination, and uninterrupted movement to succeed. When those conditions are disrupted, the formation does not fail gradually, but instead begins to fracture in visible stages. First, pace slows as vehicles negotiate obstacles and terrain changes. Then spacing tightens as following units close gaps, trying to stay protected and aligned. At this point, the column becomes easier to track, easier to predict, and harder to redirect. Despite repeated losses in similar operations, this model continues to be used because alternatives are limited and pressure remains a strategic requirement. Commanders still need to test defenses, fix Ukrainian units in place, and search for weak points along extended front lines. Small-scale probes alone cannot achieve these goals, So massed movement is chosen even when the risks are understood. On the ground, crews are ordered forward into complex terrain where visibility is poor at eye level but clear from the air. Vehicles move under the assumption that speed will compensate for exposure. Yet speed also reduces reaction time when conditions change. Once contact occurs, there is little room to adjust formations or disperse, since the environment has already narrowed options. This is why many of these assaults fail to deliver decisive outcomes, even when they inflict damage or force temporary retreats. They generate action, noise, and movement, but they rarely reshape the broader fight in a lasting way. Instead, they reveal how a traditional approach to mechanized warfare is struggling to function in a battle space defined by constant surveillance and rapid precision response. Ukraine has reshaped the early phase of these battles by using drone networks to detect and track Russian movement long before contact, which shifts control of tempo away from advancing armor. From the moment Russian columns begin to move, aerial surveillance establishes a wide view of the battlefield that ground observers cannot match, because drones remain above tree lines, villages, and terrain folds that hide vehicles from direct sight. These drones do not rush to strike, since their first task is to watch routes, confirm patterns, and mark which paths heavy vehicles are forced to use as they advance. As columns push through forests and toward settlements, their options narrow. And this is where aerial tracking becomes decisive because repeated movement along the same lanes creates clear signals. Operators focus on intersections, dirt roads, field edges, and gaps between obstacles, since these are the spaces where tanks and APCS must slow down and align. Once a route is confirmed, drones maintain persistent coverage rather than brief checks, which allows Ukrainian units to follow progress minute by minute. This constant observation removes uncertainty, because commanders no longer need to guess where pressure is building or where a push might shift next. At the same time, FPV drone feeds are shared across units, linking reconnaissance teams with artillery crews and anti-tank squads that prepare before contact occurs. Minefields play a critical role in this process, because drones help identify where vehicles are likely to be funneled once movement begins. Rather than scattering mines randomly, Ukraine uses aerial insight to shape where armor will slow, turn, or compress. As Russian units commit to these corridors, FPV drones confirm spacing, speed, and formation order, which reveals how much freedom of action remains. The result is that advancing forces lose surprise even while they are still far from the line of contact. By the time the first vehicles approach defended zones, Ukrainian units already know which elements lead, which carry infantry, and which follow with support. This knowledge allows fire control decisions to be made early, reducing the need for rapid judgment under pressure. Russian columns then face a situation where every move is visible, yet breaking away from the chosen route becomes difficult. Turning back risks congestion, spreading out risks losing protection, and stopping invites further observation. The presence of drones overhead forces Russian crews to assume they are being watched, even when no strike follows immediately. As momentum fades, the initiative shifts further toward the Ukrainians, since the advancing force must now respond to a battlefield it no longer controls. FPV drone guided awareness also limits deception, because feints and diversions are harder to hide when movement is tracked continuously. Attempts to mask intent with smoke or terrain lose value once thermal and overhead sensors maintain contact. What looks like a powerful push on maps becomes a predictable sequence from the air. Once that happens, Russian units are no longer shaping events, but moving through a space already prepared to receive them. The battlefield then favors patience and timing rather than speed, because defenders can choose when and where to apply force. In this environment, drones are not just tools, but the central layer that connects observation, planning, and execution. By controlling what is seen and when it is shared, Ukraine turns early detection into a decisive advantage that shapes every phase that follows. The moment Russian armored columns reach constrained movement zones, Ukrainian forces focus their anti-tank fire on the lead vehicles and command platforms, because this single decision reshapes everything that follows. At the front of each column, the lead tank carries more than armor and firepower, since it also sets pace, direction, and reaction timing for everything behind it. When that vehicle is hit and disabled, the column does not simply lose one platform, but it loses rhythm, clarity, and confidence at the same time. Crews behind the lead vehicle must suddenly decide whether to stop, maneuver around the wreck, or push forward without guidance. And none of those options are clean in narrow terrain. As smoke rises and debris blocks sightlines, communication becomes strained because radio traffic spikes while visual cues disappear. Command vehicles, often positioned close to the front to maintain control, become exposed during this confusion, which turns them into high-value targets once their location is revealed. When these command platforms are struck, coordination collapses further, since orders no longer flow smoothly and unit-level initiative becomes fragmented. Drivers hesitate, gunners wait for instructions that do not arrive, and infantry inside APCS delay, dismounting because the situation ahead is unclear. This hesitation spreads backward through the column, compressing spacing as vehicles close gaps to maintain mutual protection. At this stage, even undamaged vehicles lose effectiveness because their advantage depends on coordinated movement rather than isolated action. The loss of the lead vehicle also removes the buffer that absorbs the first contact, forcing trailing vehicles to face threats they were not positioned to handle. Crews must react to sudden danger while navigating obstacles created by the destroyed vehicle ahead. Turning off the route risks mines or soft ground, while reversing risks collision and further congestion. As this unfolds, Ukrainian units do not need to rush additional strikes, because time itself becomes a weapon once momentum is broken. Infantry tasked with supporting the advance often remains mounted longer than planned, since dismounting into an unclear threat environment carries its own risks. This delays efforts to secure nearby fields and open ground around the city where the fighting is unfolding. Meanwhile, the disabled lead vehicle becomes a visible reference point, making it clear that the entire column is now pinned in place. Once fixed, the formation becomes predictable, because its options shrink rapidly. Attempts to restore order by moving replacement vehicles forward rarely solve the problem, since they must navigate the same narrow approach and face the same hazards. Even when additional units arrive, they inherit the disruption rather than correcting it. The absence of a clear command node forces junior leaders to act independently, which leads to uneven responses across the column. Some crews attempt to push through, others wait, and some try to withdraw, creating conflicting movements that worsen congestion. Once the lead vehicles are disabled and the column locks up, Ukrainian FPV drones fix the jammed armor in place and relay precise positions to howitzer crews. Artillery rounds then strike the stalled corridor in sequence, adding wreckage to the blockage and leaving surviving vehicles with no room to maneuver. Within minutes, the column stops operating as a force and turns into a line of targets under continuous fire. Minefields and narrow movement corridors become the true breaking point once a mechanized column loses momentum, because they turn temporary disruption into permanent paralysis. As Russian vehicles push forward into areas seeded with mines, the first detonation rarely destroys the entire formation, but it changes the geometry of the fight in seconds. A damaged tank or APC often stops at an angle that blocks the only usable lane, which immediately traps the vehicles behind it in a confined space with no safe bypass. Heavy armor cannot easily leave these paths, since the ground beyond them may be soft, uneven, or equally mined, and turning off the route risks creating new losses instead of solving the problem. Once the lead wreck is in place, the column becomes segmented because vehicles in the rear are forced to stop while those ahead may already be disabled or burning. Crews attempt to assess the situation through limited optics, but smoke, dust, and debris reduce visibility, and slow decision-making. Engineers and recovery vehicles are often too far back to respond quickly, and moving them forward under fire becomes increasingly risky. As time passes, spacing collapses because following vehicles close gaps to avoid exposure, which compresses the formation even further. What was designed as a fast-moving assault turns into a dense cluster of machines with overlapping fields of fire and restricted angles. At this point, the column is no longer maneuvering, but waiting, and waiting under observation is a critical weakness. Ukrainian forces recognize this transition immediately, because stalled vehicles present predictable positions that can be engaged with precision. Artillery units begin to receive stable coordinates instead of fleeting targets, which increases accuracy and reduces the need for adjustment. FPV drone teams gain time to select approach paths and aim points, since targets are no longer changing location. This combination transforms the column into a static target set rather than a fluid threat. Each strike increases congestion because new wrecks add to the physical barrier already blocking movement. Secondary explosions from ammunition or fuel intensify the effect, spreading fire and debris across the narrow corridor. Crews inside intact vehicles face a growing dilemma, as staying inside risks being struck. Yet in the end, many choose to climb out of their vehicles and run into the nearby forest. The longer the column remains fixed, the fewer options remain for escape or recovery. Attempts to push vehicles forward to clear the lane often fail, because damaged platforms cannot be moved quickly under fire. Reversing is equally dangerous, since limited space and poor visibility increase the risk of collision or mechanical failure. As control erodes, individual crews begin to act independently, which breaks any remaining coordination within the formation. Some vehicles attempt to inch backward, others shut down engines to reduce signatures, and others try to withdraw without guidance. This lack of unified movement further simplifies targeting for Ukrainian forces, because patterns emerge even in chaos. Once immobilized, the column also loses its ability to shield supporting elements. Infantry cannot deploy effectively, logistics vehicles cannot approach, and command assets are forced to remain at a distance. The entire assault stalls not because of a single weapon, but because the strategy locks the formation into a position it cannot escape. This is when combined Ukrainian firepower becomes most destructive. Artillery focuses on the center of the trapped formation, while drones engage vehicles at the edges to prevent breakout. The result is a layered strike that compounds damage over time rather than relying on one decisive blow. Every destroyed vehicle reduces combat power, yet the tactical situation does not improve for the attacker. This imbalance defines the failure of the assault, because the cost continues to rise while the objective remains out of reach. Minefields and narrow corridors do not win battles alone, but they create the conditions where precision fire decides the outcome. Once a mechanized force is fixed in place, strength becomes a liability instead of an advantage. In that moment, the battlefield no longer rewards mass or speed, but punishes any formation that cannot move. FPV drones and coordinated counterattacks mark the final phase of these engagements, because once Russian formations begin to break apart, escape becomes as dangerous as advance. As immobilized columns attempt to withdraw or reposition, small and fast drones move into a role that goes beyond observation, since they actively hunt vehicles that still show signs of movement. These FPV drones approach low and from unexpected angles, targeting engine compartments, open hatches, and rear sections where armor protection is weakest. A single hit is often enough to disable a vehicle that might otherwise survive artillery fire, because damage to propulsion or crew access points ends any chance of recovery. As vehicles are struck one by one, withdrawal routes shrink, and surviving crews face mounting pressure with each loss. The presence of drones overhead forces constant movement decisions, yet every attempt to reposition exposes new vulnerabilities. Vehicles that stop to assess damage risk being fixed in place, while those that rush forward risk running into blocked lanes or fresh threats. At the same time, drone-guided artillery plays a critical supporting role because it shapes the space in which drones operate. Fire missions are adjusted in real time to seal off exits, disrupt regrouping attempts, and prevent reserves from closing in. This layered use of drones and indirect fire ensures that Russian units cannot easily stabilize after initial losses. Once escape options are reduced, Ukrainian ground forces move into a more active role. Western-supplied platforms, such as Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, enter the fight at this stage, not as breakthrough tools, but as controlled support elements. Their task is to suppress remaining resistance, secure key points, and protect Ukrainian infantry as they advance or consolidate ground. These vehicles operate with caution, using cover and short movements rather than rapid thrusts, because the goal is control rather than speed. Fire from these platforms is directed at buildings, tree lines, and suspected firing positions that threaten friendly troops. The integration of these platforms is tightly linked to drone feeds, which guide movement and reduce uncertainty at close range. Commanders rely on aerial views to decide when to push forward and when to pause, avoiding exposure to unseen threats. In this environment, the value of Western vehicles lies in reliability and precision rather than mass. They provide steady fire support, protected mobility for infantry, and a visible signal that control is shifting on the ground. However, they do not operate alone or ahead of the system, since their effectiveness depends on the same drone network that shaped earlier phases. FPV drones deny escape, artillery denies regrouping, and armored support denies local resistance. Each layer closes gaps left by the others, leaving few options for forces caught in the collapse. In these battles, the final outcome is decided less by dramatic clashes and more by sustained control over space, time, and visibility. Many destroyed armored vehicles and stalled mechanized pushes now point to a hard reality that can no longer be ignored. Large-scale assaults built on speed and mass are colliding with a battlefield shaped by constant surveillance, dense minefields, and precise firepower. Across this fight, drones expose movement early, narrow terrain removes flexibility, and accurate strikes punish every delay, turning numerical strength into a growing liability. What emerges is not the end of tanks or armored vehicles, but the end of using them as blunt instruments that rely on momentum alone. Control of information, timing, and coordination now matters more than how many vehicles enter the field. This shift forces both sides into a difficult test. Russia must decide whether it can redesign its assaults to survive under drone pressure, or whether repeating familiar methods will keep producing the same costly results. Ukraine faces its own challenge because sustaining a system built on UAV dominance and precision fire demands constant adaptation and resources. The bigger question remains open. Is this the stable future of modern warfare, or just another phase before the balance shifts again? Share your thoughts in the comments, and for more clear reporting on real battles, modern weapons, and the strategies shaping today's wars, like, share, and subscribe to Military Force.